Coogs House. The Houston Cougars are in the Big 12, and we are here at Big 12 Media Days, having a good time. Let's jump on into what Brett Yormark had to say, our new conference commissioner.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, so welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, to break down all things Cougs from Houston's first time at Big 12 Media Days. We're trying this out. The Wi-Fi is a little wonky. Things are not great. We'll see how things go, but I'm excited to talk to you guys about what Brett Yormark had to say. Before we jump in too far, remember to like and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. I'll bring all kinds of Big 12 content all year long, and doing a giveaway every 250 subscribers, so make sure you subscribe down below and comment to let us know that you are in the contest. If you have nothing else to say, tell us what your favorite memory of the Southwest Conference is, maybe, or a favorite memory of playing a Big 12 school, maybe. We'll get into all that as we go. First, we're going to talk some about how Brett Yormark reflected back on his first year as commissioner in the 2022-23 school year. Then we're going to look forward as to where the conference is headed. And lastly, some thoughts about the forward-thinking Brett Yormark. I want to first emphasize, though, that Brett Yormark is the dude for this. Things are working really, really well here in the Big 12. Now, he was quick to point out that the Big 12 had several national title teams in 2022-23. 80% of the teams made it into a bowl game of some kind. He talked about Texas Tech, all the teams that made bowl games. 70% of the teams in the conference made it to the March Madness hoops tournament. 60% of the women's teams. They had the Heisman runner-up. They also had the National College Football Playoff runner-up. They signed a major TV deal that extends from 2025 to 2031. He accelerated the OU-UT withdrawal, which I think some of the OU fans and Texas fans are a little upset about. But I admit I have to say I smiled a little bit in hearing that was one of his things he thought they accomplished this year in the conference. They hosted the first business summit with a business advisory board that was created for the conference. Honestly, still diving into that. Sounds really fascinating, interesting. More on that will come. We'll talk more about that in a later segment, but more on that is coming for sure. They outlined and planned out the first Big 12 Pro Day with the NFL. They created this partnership with Mexico in this past school year. They became the second biggest conference in social media following, and I think that's worth pointing out when we look at what conferences will be next. The next generation of people will continue to talk about things on social media. Well, Houston and the Big 12 are as big as anyone involved in that. That's a big, big moment. He also touched some on Rucker Park and this basketball thing going into next couple weeks, actually, where different basketball coaches are going to be hosting some clinics and stuff like that in the historic Rucker Park. And then he connected some stuff to how they've been working with Capitol Hill on NIL legislation and things like that. Now, I run through that list really, really quickly, guys. I want to say for a first year in the Big 12, that's really, 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 really strong, right? I want to stress that, that's a lot of things to get accomplished for a conference that, back before they added Houston, people were talking about, is this conference going to survive losing Oklahoma and Texas? And not only are they surviving, they're thriving and pushing them out earlier, right? That's a big, big deal. I think we got to make sure we look at this when we look at the Big 12 as a whole. In their first year with Brett Yormark, he accomplished a lot. Now, with some of that obviously predicated on, the strength of the TCU program, Finney Dykes and Dugan, I guess. But some of it's also adding schools like Houston. Some of it's also adding the big markets like Houston into the fold here, looking at big dollar type things, because we see how those will play out into adding up with all of the other schools and all the TV deals and stuff like that. I cannot stress enough that obviously that TV deal was the biggest part that you could have pushed. It's the biggest accomplishments of the year for Brett. Again, 2025 to 2031, so it's a shorter deal. You'll be re-upping around the same time as some of the places that have longer deals, but you're also have this start date in 2025 where you have some wiggle room to find new schools if you want it or whatnot. We'll get to more about what's looking ahead of the conference in a second. But as far as schools joining that conference and potentially getting in on that deal, it did feel a little bit like Yormark didn't want to get too far ahead of himself or out over his skis in talking about what could be coming or what is coming. I will just say that the excitement about the schools that are coming for this fall, Houston and then BYU, Cincinnati, Central Florida, was palpable. There was excitement in the air about adding those markets, and specifically to Houston. I want to pull up the quote and make sure I got it right here. But he said, listen, Houston's a top 10 market that's critically important to us, the Big 12. It's got great history and great legacy. They're excited to be in a market like Houston. Now, all of that is to say that in looking at back at the past, the Big 12 was a hyper-successful conference, only getting bigger, stronger, and better. And that kind of conference is excited about adding Houston because of the reasons you and I know, right? It's got a giant footprint, got high-end recruiting, high-end athletics, great history if you go back all the way. Great basketball program right now, a building football program right now, a coach that knows the Big 12 and Power 5 football right now. Other sports need to get involved in this too, like volleyball is fairly strong. Baseball's kind of been a little bit roller coaster lately, right? But those kinds of things can tag in. The track and field, super tremendous. I forget them, right? Super tremendous and moving into the Big 12. It's also something that regionally makes sense, and the state of Texas and all of that. Really exciting to look at where these things go. I have to say that looking back at how he looked back in the past made me more excited to be in this conference. Then hearing that he was excited about Houston being in this conference is also really good to hear. The other thing I think is worth pointing out and looking at what he highlighted from the past is that this is a successful conference top to bottom, right? Dana said the same kinds of things, but this is a conference with a lot of parity, a lot of talent, and everyone goes to a bowl game, right? Not every, but almost everyone goes to a bowl game. Almost everyone makes the college basketball tournament, right? And frankly, they had similar statistics about College World Series and those kinds of things. This is a successful conference at a national level that Houston's getting to be a part of, and that was evidenced by a bunch of the statistics that Yormark threw up on the wall there for a second. And I have to say, that's exciting to see Houston join. I think I've said excited 1,000 times. If you were keeping track at home of how many times I said excited or some version of exciting, tell us in the comments down below. Now, I will say that on the whole, it was a good day for Houston, a good day for the Cougars, and honestly, if you're looking at how things go, I'd be remiss to not point out that things went really well, with the exception of this 1-2 Wi-Fi issue. Things have gone really well here at Big 12 Media Days, but if you'd like things to go well for you, we need to make sure that you're adding yourself to a championship team, and that's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. When it's the same thing that comes to your vehicle, right? Every part needs to fit just right. So next time you need to parts, accessories, head to eBay Motors, the eBay Guaranteed Fit. You can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. With just over 122 million parts to choose from, we're back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home and win when the right parts are guaranteed. That's right, they're guaranteed. Get the right parts, get the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. That's right, eBay Motors, guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions do apply. Now, in the second segment here, I want to talk some about where the conference is headed. And I thought it was interesting to hear Brett Yormark talk a lot more about where the conference is headed off of the field. He started talking about leaning into a strategic plan for student athletes' well-being. Obviously, that's talking some about social emotional health, and I think we look at Gen Zs and people younger than millennials, because I'm a millennial, I'm well out of college, right? When you look at those kinds of people, you're looking at keeping social media stuff, not necessarily positive or fluffy, but keeping them in a good headspace. Mental strength conditioning, I think, is the thing that you look at a lot of programs doing. And so where can we find those ways to grow as a conference? Also, tying that into the modern NIL market, there were several different moments that Yormark talked about NIL and tying into things with Congress and Capitol Hill and kind of how do we navigate this new world in a way that helps the athletes, the schools, the institutions, gets kids compensated, but also keeps them safe and keeps them from being taken advantage of and those kinds of things. And he's already talking about the connections he's made with Capitol Hill from his times as a guy in professional sports and how he's grown those into his time in college sports and tying all of those together to kind of look at how to revamp this landscape. There are other things we talk about in the future, but I have to say that was an impressive one to me because that's something you don't hear a whole lot of people hear about. Pac-12 and Big Ten, people talking about conference expansion and TV rights, and we're all going digital. But like the forethought he's doing there with some social, emotional kind of stuff, looking at like, we're going to take care of the athletes and make this the place they want to play because they are taken care of better than anywhere else. That was really, really big time to me. I also think he talked some about expansion. He said, they're okay with 12. They'll live with 12. They like the 12 they've got. But in moving forward, you could see, theoretically, teams that add value. He kept going back to add value. He didn't talk about regions. He didn't talk about coast to coast. He talked about teams that add value. Now, this is totally me reading between the lines. I interpreted that as meaning a UConn because they add a value. He didn't say like the most value or a maximal value or anything like that, but he did say add some kind of value, and that's why I look at UConn being that kind of thing, because they add so much basketball value. For what it's worth, when you look at like other schools joining at like a smaller market share or whatever, like a San Diego State, right? Yes, it gets the Big 12 into California, but if they're not going to make as much money as other Big 12 schools, are they really going to net a lot of money coming out of this with having to like send their volleyball team and pay for them to fly to West Virginia twice a season, right? Like those kinds of things can get a little hazy if you're not making the full $32 million in TV revenue or whatever, right? And so I think that what's happening is those things must be harder to see through than we might have realized. And so I don't mean to say that Yormark is backpedaling, although he did use that word himself. I think it's more like he's seeing that the more realistic soon option might be something that just adds some value, not the most value. Now, I'm saying that by the time you hear this, who knows, maybe it'll go public that something crazy has happened. I don't know. I didn't get any indications of that, but I did get indications that he's not exactly like pushing to like make this a big deal right away. It didn't seem like he wanted to like go rah-rah and push forward on talking about conference realignment in today's Big 12, because today's Big 12 Media Day was all about this upcoming season. So like he got those questions, looked forward some, but didn't give a whole lot because he wanted to focus on looking forward to this season, right? The other thing I think is interesting he looked forward to is he looked at like this international strategy. University of Houston's very involved, but they're adding in the Mexico games, right? They're adding in a lot of Big 12 games across Hispanic radio stations, Spanish-speaking radio stations, right? They're adding in the footprint, getting into Mexico. They're adding on ESPN Deportes for a number of different broadcasts as well. They're looking to get international in a way that we'll talk some in like what makes me so excited about Yormark in the last segment. But that is also forward thinking because, frankly, if you look at like the United States and the 50, the lower 48, or I guess you want to include Hawaii or whatever, like college sports have kind of already dominated that part of the world, right? You can start trying to steal things, like you can go try to steal Southern California, you can go try and steal the Midwest, you can go try and whatever, or, and this is where Yormark is forward thinking, I feel like, you can go find whole new territory. There are not American college football fans in Mexico, or there are not like the amount that there are in Alabama, but there are sports fans. It's a popular sport enough there that you can like kind of latch on to some. You can start to build this thing forward, right? So those kinds of ideas were really, really interesting to see him talk about. Initially, we look at the forward-thinking plan that Brett Yormark has. A lot of different stuff going on, obviously, but worth mentioning that he did in fact look like a very confident guy about the conference moving forward after Oklahoma and Texas leave. Now, Oklahoma fans didn't like that. One or two asked questions even about like, why would you expect that, And he was like, simple. He's like, they didn't want to be here. They didn't want to be here. We don't want them. And we came to an agreement about getting stuff done, right? He said it in a little more professional than that, but it was as simple as like, listen, we're going to move forward, and this is the best place to be. This is the best conference to be in because of it. It's the best conference to be in because of the growth, because of the directions, because of the ways they're going. I don't think he's just blowing smoke there, right? Because we heard in the American, like we're Power 6, they're Power 5, blah, blah, like people like almost sound like they're combative when they're trying to push back on things they don't actually believe, like the way the American Athletic Conference might have been. That's not what Yormark was saying at all. Yormark was much more matter of fact, but like, listen, this is a booming conference. It is growing, it is moving, it is not standing still. Other conferences are. He didn't say the Big X, he didn't say the Pac-12, didn't even say the SEC, but the implication was that some of those players, and a lot of them, are standing still and not moving forward with the times, with where things are going, into finding ways to maximize this basketball market, into finding ways to get in every TV slot, into different things like that. The TV slot thing made me think, actually. He mentioned the idea of, because so many schools in Texas and the South and Central Florida being one similar, I guess, like the idea of having a number of Friday night games for a Power 5 conference had previously been like not something you wanted to do, right? You wanted primetime TV, but realistically, if half your teams are hosting games in places that's like 110 degrees at noon on Saturday, can you find ways to maximize and spend the TV revenue from a Friday night, right? Because that's a window that you can occupy on your own on a Friday. And I think it was interesting to hear Power 5 guys spin that, what has previously been thought of as like, in the past, this is not something we want. In the future, if you're the way of looking at things, it's we're going to find ways to make that the marquee event on a Friday. And we've seen the NFL do that too, right? They've like, we'll take Mondays, but we'll also take a random Thursday, and we'll take Christmas, and we'll take whatever days there are. We'll take Saturdays when college football is over. Like, that's kind of the same way this is going. And so it's really interesting to see that as well. Now, in the third segment, and I know that this is a little bit shorter episode, and that's whatever, but I'm not sure, how well this is recording because of the Wi-Fi issues at AT&T Stadium. I talked to Ryan Monso today, and he was livid about those, so I'm sure he's going to put something together, and I would echo that the Wi-Fi is not great. The rest of the day has been fine. The Wi-Fi has not been great. But the other thing I want to talk about some is that Brett Yormark talked about the future of the conference. The forward-thinking nature of Brett Yormark is the future of the conference, right? And I think when that struck me was when hearing him talk about the international growth of this conference, right? Going into Mexico, because it's a new territory for the TV market. It is next door, very literally, to a lot of the schools. The Hispanic market, also Spanish-speaking market specifically, goes up into even more schools across the country than just the Texas 4 that will be in the conference after Texas leaves. It's also worth pointing out that, that's just the first of this. You could then also tie into some Caribbean. You could also tie into further south. You could also tie into further east. You could keep this thing kind of going and keep this thing kind of growing and growing and growing. He also pointed out, and this isn't necessarily the most about Houston, but, honestly, when you look at the Big 12 and the addition of the new 4 schools, BYU has an international footprint, right? Houston and the Texas schools have this Spanish-speaking footprint. This idea that the Big 12 can get beyond the continental 48 is kind of contingent on the 4 schools that we're adding this year, right? That's where Houston comes in, right? That's where BYU comes in. That's a big, big part of where the conference is going. To have that kind of forethought, I think, is really, really impressive, important, fundamental in why I'm so faithful in what Brett Yormark is doing with the conference. I also think it's worth pointing out that it's the kind of business mind that got him tied up with a guy like Jay-Z and the Brooklyn Nets in the first place. It's the kind of business mind that got him tied up into high-end pro sports media in the first place, right? It's how all those things happen, and it's not an accident by any stretch, right, that the Big 12 is this conference that is going to be at the forefront of all of these things. When the Big 12 signs separate basketball and football TV deals in 2031, don't be surprised, right? When the Big 12 finds a way to go coast to coast and have a premier game in every single time slot on ESPN, don't be surprised. It will be wall-to-wall Big 12 football some Saturday in the near future with Big 12 matchups dominating each of the TV windows because you're in each different time zone, right? All interesting, all fascinating, and again, that's just where this Big 12 thing is going. But Yormark was fun to hear from. He is enthusiastic. He is excited. He is determined to make the Big 12 a biggest conference in America. I don't think he has his sights set on being a Big 3. He even mentioned at one point that when someone asked about being competitive with other Power 5s, where he said they don't compare themselves with the Power 5s, it's just comparing themselves with themselves. Where can the Big 12 go? How big can the Big 12 be? How strong can the Big 12 product be? And I think that's why I'm so confident where this thing goes. I'm also confident Houston's role in it, Houston playing a pivotal role in it, and I'm confident you come back to Locked On Cougs each and every day to come back and check on the Houston Cougars and that journey in the Big 12, all football season, basketball season, and so on. Thank you all so much for bearing with me today. I don't know don't know how quite the Wi-Fi and all of this is working. We will see for sure. But thank you all. Hit subscribe down below. Like and comment as always. Remember, make sure you enter the contest for every 250 subscribers. We're giving something away. At 1,500 is the next barrier. And for your next episode, I'm going to say go listen to some of the Locked On show from the Big 12 because it was a fun media day to be a part of. And go listen to BYU Cougars. Jake was here. Jake was great. Right? Thank you all so much for listening to Locked On Cougs. Locked On Cougs is the primary Locked On podcast network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.